Steve here. Before we start the show, I just wanted to let you know that you can now support Rootbound on Patreon. Learn how, plus more ways to support the podcast at rootboundpodcast.com/support. Now, on with the show. You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Rootbound is brought to you by Kale Chimp. Did you know that chimpanzees eat kale? Apparently at the zoo, some do. Visit rootboundpodcast.com/KaleChimp for an exclusive offer. Kale Chimp. Apparently some chimps eat kale. Who knew?
Hello everyone, and thank you for listening to another episode of Rootbound. My name is Steve, and before we get started with the episode, I thought it would be a good time to remind everyone out there how Rootbound works. I haven't done that reminder for a while, so here it goes. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, and each week I invite on a guest who tells me about a plant that means something to them, and then I tell the guest about a plant that means something to me, and through this process we all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. Now, I'm not going to spend too much more time on this intro part of the podcast because the density of dazzling details brought by our guest this week is through the roof, so let's just get right to it. Hi, Kristina. Welcome to Rootbound.
Hi, Steve. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Very good. Do you have a plant to share with us today?
I do. My plant is agave.
Oh, awesome. I love agave mainly for tequila purposes.
Yes.
But I'm excited to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah. That is what agave is associated with, tequila, and recently as a sugar substitute in contemporary culture.
Oh, yeah.
And, I always thought agave's primary use is culinary until I visited an Aztec craft center near Teotihuacan in Mexico, where I was introduced to the versatility of agave beyond its culinary uses. And so when you asked me to come on this podcast and choose a plant, the first thing that popped into my mind was agave, because I have this memory of the guide at the Aztec craft center shaving and shredding and pulling apart the leaf of the agave plant and just showing us all of its different uses. But, I was still considering other plants. I was thinking, okay, like if it's a plant podcast, I have to choose a plant that's, unique for being a plant in and of itself, like something that has like a unique process of photosynthesis or maybe reproduction. But in the end, I just had to come to terms with the fact that, to be honest, I don't know if I'm interested in plants in and of themselves. I'm more interested in the way that plants have influenced human civilizations and communities. And agave is an incredible example of a plant that is a living and evolving member of a human community, particularly in Mexico and southwestern United States.
Very good. Well, I am a big fan of how plants and humans interact. I think that's why this podcast is what it's for, so I'm very glad you made that choice. I like the cool, weird scientific things and stuff that is botanical about plants, but I like it when it's somebody who cares about that telling me, So, and my personal interest in plants is a little bit more about how they're used, which I'll get into when I talk about my plant a little bit. But and maybe I'll jump in because agave is something I almost made this a special episode, which we only talk about one plant, but I felt like I wasn't quite there with my relationship with agave. But I do have some fun personal agave experiences that I might share later.
I started doing research on agave last night, and now I'm that much more interested in the plant. And anybody growing up in Southern California, as I did, is familiar with the rosettes of the strong, fleshy leaves covered with its spiny edges. And agave, comes in all different sizes and slightly different shades, different leaf patterns. But this is what I found out. So agave is a genus, and it includes over 300 species.
Whoa.
And it's native. Yeah, it's native to the hot and arid regions of the Americas. But there are some species that can be found in the tropical regions of South America. And here I came across a new word. This is what I loved about doing my research. I learned some new words. And this word is xerophyte, and it comes from the Greek xeros phuton, and xerophyte refers to a plant that has adaptations to survive in an environment with little liquid water. So
Is that with
agave
an
is a
X?
xerophyte. Yes, with an
Yeah.
X.
Yes.
Xerophyte. Yes. And
Cool.
then I learned another new word, and that is monocarpic, from mono meaning single and carpos fruit. And monocarpic refers to plants that flower and shed seeds only once and then die. Most agave are monocarpic because each individual rosette flowers only once and then dies.
The whole
There are
plant?
some, flowers only once and then
Whoa.
dies. There
Whoa.
are some polycarpic species of agave, but mainly they are monocarpic. So, what does flowering mean for agave? So, during flowering, a tall stem or a mast grows out of the center of the rosette, and the mast can be very tall. Actually, I looked it
Have you
up.
seen that before? Have you seen that in
Yes,
person?
yes.
Yeah. It's
If you're hiking anywhere in Southern
yeah.
California, you will see these masts coming out of the rosettes of
It's
the
so cool
agave
because
plant.
I feel like we when I at least first learned about agave, you just think of it as just like it looks like a giant aloe or something like that, you know. But then when you learn about the flowers and these like giant stalks that come out of the middle of them, it's very cool looking.
Yeah. And I'm actually going to get to the aloe because when I first told my boyfriend Rob that I'm going to do a podcast on agave, he's like, well, don't forget the aloe. And I learned something very interesting that
Oh, okay.
aloe is not agave.
I think I knew that, but they look very similar. They do, right?
Yeah. They look really similar, and they are actually part of the same order. And the order is Asparagales, which is the same order as asparagus. So, speaking of the masts of the agave, they look like giant asparagi.
Oh, so this is interesting. I haven't talked about this plant, and I probably will sometime, but just a little spoiler. There's also a plant called the yucca or the yucca with two C's, not with one C. Very similar, and it sends up this stalk that looks like a giant asparagus too.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, aloe and agave are of the same order, Asparagales, and then agave and yucca are actually part of the same family.
Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense.
So
Yes.
yucca and agave are closer related than agave and aloe, but they are still different genuses.
Very interesting. Yes, cool.
Yeah. Also, I learned that one of the best ways to tell the difference between aloe and agave is by their habitat. So, aloe are native to tropical regions of southern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean. Although aloe has become naturalized to nearly every part of the world, agave is native only to the dry regions of the Americas.
Ah, I see. Very interesting.
Back to flowering, how does this work? So the mast grows super tall. The Guinness Book of World Record is 40 feet
Whoa.
or 12 meters. Yeah.
Whoa. That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah. And the mast eventually bears a large number of short tubular flowers, but after the flowers bloom, the original rosette desiccates or dries up and dies. Now, humans can slow the process of the death of the aloe, but they can't, of the agave, but they can't prevent it. So, what happens in some regions of Mexico is that they will cut the mast off as it starts to grow to prolong the life of the rosette. But eventually, after the mast does grow, the plant will die.
Interesting. That reminds me, there's some other plants like this, and maybe you can confirm if this is the case. And it makes sense, I guess, because it being a xerophile or xerophyte. What did you say?
Xerophyte.
A xerophyte. It needs, because plants need sun and water, and it's got plenty of sun, but the water takes a while, right? And so it needs this time to build up the power and the water and the resources to flower. So it's just sitting there collecting sun for so long, and then eventually it's like, okay, it's ready. I'm going to send up my flower and like reproduce. But
Yeah.
if you cut it, like you said, then I imagine the plant's like, oh, something happened to my flower. I need a little more time, right?
Yeah, exactly. It basically expends all of its energy on this flowering process, all of the water that it's stored up, and as a result, it just has not enough nutrients to survive after the flowering, the blooming.
Interesting. So interesting.
But as as it matures and begins to flower, there are suckers that form just above the roots at the base of the rosette, and these suckers will go on to form new plants. Now, you might be familiar with the suckers by the term pups.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, I have no green thumb. And perhaps the only plant that has ever lasted in my household was actually an agave plant. It lived maybe for 1 year before I somehow killed it. But it did produce pups. And I was told that I'm supposed to remove those pups and then place them in separate pots so that they can then develop their own mast and grow into maturity.
Interesting. Yeah, that's like all those people who are really into like growing various succulents. Those are a lot of the times who those reproduce. What was like? I lost what I was going to say. Continue. Sorry.
Yeah. So in addition to being a monocarpic xerophyte, agave is also a perennial. And I knew the term perennial, but I was surprised to learn that perennial is not a plant that flowers every year. A perennial is rather a term that describes a plant that lives more than 2 years and grows very slowly. And so many species of agave can live 60 years before flowering. I was actually reading about a rosette at the University of Michigan that lived to be 80 years old and grew so tall that the workers had to remove one of the panes of the greenhouse window to let it grow out of the facility. That's how tall the plant was.
Amazing.
Yeah. And because they live so long, agave are frequently referred to as century plants or centurions.
I just learned that the other day because I have this app called Seek that lets you point it at plants and it tells you what the plant is. And there was an agave. It was an agave, I think, Americana, and it said century plant. And I was like, whoa, I had never heard that before. Really fascinating.
Yeah, agave Americana is the largest category of agave, and most of the agave that you see growing in gardens around California, the ones that people plant for aesthetic reasons, they are the agave Americana.
Very interesting.
So, other thing that I learned that I was quite surprised by is that agave is not a Native American word. I had assumed that since agave is native to this part of the world, that the term would have had its roots here as well. But agave is actually from the ancient Greek, meaning illustrious or noble, which of course refers to its very strong, powerful mass that grows out of the center of the rosette.
Interesting. That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah. And in Spanish, agave is referred to as maguey, which is Maguey, which is kind of similar to the Nahuatl. So Nahuatl is the most widely spoken indigenous language of Mexico. And in Nahuatl, agave is metal. And so I thought maguey, metal, maybe kind of similar, but I did some research into an etymological dictionary. And the conclusion is that the word maguey probably comes from the Taino word Mawe.
Interesting.
Now, the Taino were a Caribbean people that Columbus first encountered upon arriving in what is today the Bahamas. And so this suggests that agave, by the time that Columbus had arrived, had already made its way into the cultures of the Caribbean. And it's also one of the first plants that fascinated Europeans when they came to the Americas. And so agave, or Mawe in Taino, or maguey in Spanish, was introduced to Europe in the mid-16th century. And if we remember, Columbus began his pillaging, raiding, and destruction in 1492. So that's just about 50 years after Columbus arrived. We already have agave plants in Europe.
Super fast. That is so interesting. Wow. Really, people were really into it.
Some of the other ways that agave is referred to in legend and in folklore and just in popular culture is the plant of 1,000 uses. And this is really why I became interested in agave and what I remember about that demonstration from the Aztec Cultural Center. It's also called the Tree of Wonders. In fact, it was so important to Mesoamerican culture that there is a goddess, Mayawel, who is associated with the plant and is a symbol of fertility. In Aztec art, the kind of like headdress of this goddess resembles the agave plant. But yeah, let's get into its uses.
Yeah, yes, we're
So
excited for this.
tequila, that's the
Yeah,
first thing.
indeed.
Yeah, tequila, mezcal, right? So all tequila is mezcal, but not all mezcal is tequila. Did you know that, Steve?
I did because Carl and I visited Oaxaca a few years ago, which is a center of mezcal, but not very much tequila.
So yeah, so mezcal is a vast category of spirits made from agave, and tequila is a small subset of mezcal made from a very specific type of agave called blue agave, agave azul.
Also known as agave tequiliana, which I love it when
Yes, agave tequiliana, yeah.
the scientific names have a booze in the name. That's always fun. Which fun fact? Well, my plant kind of is in that same vein, but we'll get to it later.
Did you notice how I didn't say any of the Latin names and I let you pronounce all of them?
Clever, clever. I'm very bad at pronouncing Latin names, but I'm happy to take that bullet for you.
Yeah, so there are actually over 40 different types of agave that are used in mezcal making. And that means that there's a great variety and types of mezcals on the market. So to make mezcal, mezcaleros take the core of the agave plant, known as the piña, and they roast it in canonical pits in the ground before distillation. And this cooking method is why mezcals often taste smokier than tequilas. Whereas to make tequila, the blue agave piña is steamed rather than roasted before distillation.
That makes I kind of always wonder that, and I've seen mezcal being made. We went to a mezcaleria in Oaxaca, and we saw the process of this big pit where they're stirring it. And I've gotten really into fermentation lately, and so think about how it works. And the trick is you got to get the sugars right, and it's something so like piney and woody like mezcal. The sugars aren't going to be free, so cooking it makes sense. But I was wondering about tequila. And it makes sense. They're steaming it to loosen the sugars or free the sugars as opposed to roasting it. Super cool.
Yeah, but the traditional drink of Mesoamerica is not mezcal or tequila, but pulque. And there's a 2,000-year tradition of making pulque from agave. In fact, I found these really cool illustrations from 16th century Franciscan codices of the indigenous people of Mexico fermenting pulque. Yeah, so pulque is made from the fermented sap of the agave plant. And the way the sap is harvested is that the mast is cut at the base right before the time of maturity, right before it flowers. And then the sap collects in the middle of the rosette, and that produces enough of that liquid for fermentation.
Whoa, I didn't know that. I've had pulque before, but I didn't know that was the process. It's a really fun drink. It can be a little bit pulpy because you get some of the pulpiness in there. But yeah, I was in Mexico City and Xochimilco, which is like this area that has all these canals. They call it the Venice of Mexico. And these guys will pull up on their little boat and sell you pulque. So I have this picture of me with all of Carla's family holding a giant like styrofoam cup of pulque, and I was very happy.
Yeah, and pulque, as described by Wikipedia, is the color of milk with a viscous consistency and a sour yeast-like taste.
Mm-hmm.
So Wikipedia
right.
doesn't make it sound very good, but I've tried it before and I actually enjoyed it. What did you think, Steve?
Yeah, I liked it too, and I like that class of alcoholic beverage, which sometimes are called chichas, which they're cool because they're really. A lot of alcohol is from a European tradition, but this kind of drink is really from an American tradition of these kind of pulpy beverages that are very naturally fermented and they're their own funky thing, which I think a lot of people haven't experienced, but they're starting to, and yeah, it's fun.
So I think it's really cool to think that you have 3 different alcohols that are made from this one genus, agave. And in addition to drinks, agave has 4 edible parts, so it's used popularly in cuisine. Those are the flowers are edible, the leaves are edible, the stalks are edible, and of course the sap, which is make the pulque. And it has been a major food source for the indigenous people of Mexico, as well as the Navajo and the Hohokam people of the southwestern United States. So yeah, used widely throughout indigenous cuisine. But
I want to eat some agave leaves and flowers. I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, they're prepared in many different ways, and I was looking up some of their recipes, but I was just really interested to get into some of its other uses because, of course, when we think of a plant, I think the first thing we think of is how to eat it, how to make alcohol of it, but plants are
Yeah.
useful in other ways as well. Yeah, so other uses of agave. So the leaves of the agave have spines, which make it a perfect choice for live fencing to control cattle and also to prevent erosion. So if you're driving through the Mexican countryside today, sometimes you'll see farms surrounded by agave plants, and there's actually a purpose for that. That it's this live fencing system that not just separates farms but protects what's inside the agriculture.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah. The stalks can also be dried and used to make musical instruments such as windpipes. So agave is used in, some traditional music of the indigenous people. Agave has medicinal and hygienic uses. Since the sap is highly caustic, it has been traditionally used to cleanse wounds. And the juice of the leaves can be used for soap and detergent. In fact, it lathers with suds similar to store-bought soap.
Wow, that's incredible. Oh my gosh, I gotta try some agave soap.
But I think probably some of the coolest part of the agave is its fiber. Okay, so if you pound the leaves and remove the pulp, it yields these thick fibrous strands that have been used by the indigenous people and still continue to be used today. These strands can be used for making tools such as rope, fishing nets, baskets, and bags for carrying storage. In fact, agave rope is so strong that it's still used as cords in mining and in shipping. And the fibers can also be used for textiles to make mats, blankets, and clothes. And the fibers absorb natural pigments very easily, so textiles made from agave fiber are very bright and colorful. In fact, until I found this out, I didn't realize that I had already seen textiles made from agave during my travels in Mexico. So a lot of that kind of like traditional textile art, I would say a lot, but at least some of that traditional textile art is made with agave fiber.
Wow, how did I not know that either? That is so cool. I'm looking at some pictures now. I had to Google agave rope, and it does look cool. I'm also going to Google agave textiles because I gotta see what you mean as far as.
Yeah, and agave.
Yeah.
Yeah. And agave is also sometimes referred to as the needle and thread plant because the thorny tip of the leaf can be used as a needle or awl. So if the leaf is trimmed and scraped correctly, it leaves behind an already threaded needle, meaning the needle is the tip and the fibers form the thread. So you could just start weaving as soon as you dry the fiber.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool. And I guess, yeah, you could just like start going and then adding more to it as you go, I guess, right? If you run out of that one. That is amazing.
It's also used in construction. So the spines on the edges of the leaves, especially of the larger agave plants, are so strong when they're dried that they can be used as nails. When the leaves are dried, they can be used for thatched roofing. And the leaves are concave, so they actually form natural gutters on thatched roofs.
I'm just gobsmacked about all these uses. This is just incredible.
But I think this is definitely the cool. For me, this was definitely the most shocking use is that agave has been used as paper for centuries.
Whoa!
So yeah, if you strip the bark of the leaves in the right way, or also if you pound the leaves and dry the pulp, you can make paper from agave. So each leaf, if stripped correctly, actually contains two pieces of paper, one on the inside and one on the outside of the leaf. And agave paper was used in codices for economic and ritual purposes before the arrival of the Spanish. And there's some records of agave paper being used as early as the 1st century. And you know what? There's still more to discover about agave. Today, agave is being considered as a potential source of biofuel because of its high sugar content. So who knows? Maybe in the future, we're going to be running on agave cars.
Wow. Fascinating. Oh my gosh. Do you have any other fun facts or dazzling details? I feel like the amount of dazzling details here has been like the most dense of any plant we've talked about. And
no, so that's what I have in terms, obviously there was also ritual uses of agave. It was inspiration for art and aesthetics. If you are familiar with Aztec art, Aztec headdresses, they're very reminiscent of the agave plant. So we know that these cultures respected this plant and certainly used it extensively, both in their daily life as well as their ritual practices. So I just think it's an incredible plant that made possible so many things. Like, for example, just having really strong rope provides for so much technological innovation. If you think about Mexico City, you said you've been there, right? Mexico City was built on a lake. So the Aztecs created these islands by pounding stakes into the ground. Well, these stakes were tied together by, guess what? Agave cord.
Agave.
Thank you for sharing about agave today. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
I would love that. Thank you, Steve.
I feel like it's, we may not get quite as deep, but I was very impressed by your presentation of agave, and I'm going to be like going down rabbit holes about it for a while now. But my plant I chose also has an alcohol use, and it's called the Scuppernong.
Wow.
Are you familiar with the Scuppernong?
No, I'm not. The Scuppernong?
Scuppernong. Scuppernong. You might know a little bit more. I'm going to tell you its Latin name now, and this might give you a clue. Its Latin name is Vitis rotundifolia. Does that first word vitis mean anything to you?
I don't know. It reminds me of the Czech king. Is that...
Unrelated. So
Okay.
vitis is the genus for grapes.
Viticulture.
Indeed, in viticulture. There you go. And the the grape that most people know, the one that is used in winemaking in Europe, is Vitis vinifera. So there's that vine, wine thing in there. Vitis rotundifolia is a native grape to North America, and it's sometimes called. It is known as the Scuppernong, and I'm going to get a little bit. There's actually a little bit. I'm growing Scuppernong, but we'll get into a second. The Vitis rotundifolia, the more common name for the whole species, is called muscadine grapes, and Scuppernong is a particular variety of muscadine grape, all under Vitis rotundifolia, which means round leaf grape. It's native to North America. Now, a lot of times when people think about American grapes, we think about the story about how the American grape both caused the death of European grapes and then saved European grapes because of this disease called phylloxera. This is not the grape that saved or killed the European grape, though. That is the fox grape, or Vitis labrusca. What's interesting about Vitis rotundifolia, though, there's actually a ton of native grapes, but the Scuppernong, some people argue it actually should be in its own genus because it has 40 chromosomes instead of 38 like all the grapes. So and it is a little bit different. It grows more in the south. It's like they call it the southern grape. It thrives in more humid and hot climates than most grapes do. It has a much thicker skin than a lot of grapes. The skin is quite thick. And so even though it's still in the Vitis genus, some people say maybe it should be its own thing. And it also doesn't graft well with other genuses in the grapes. So like the way that they saved the European grapes is they grafted European vine stock onto American root stock, and that made the grapes more immune to phylloxera, which is a North American grape disease. But the muscadine, though it is mostly immune to phylloxera, you can't really graft other grapes to it, so it's not good for that purpose. However, you can make wine with it, and wine has been made with the muscadine grape, particularly the Scuppernong variety, because the Scuppernongs are bigger and sweeter than the more wild muscadines, which tend to be smaller. The Scuppernong is also normally a bronze-ish color and makes a nice white wine, but there are other muscadines that are other colors. Going to some history, because I know that you're a historian. I thought I would throw in a little bit of history. There is some reference to these grapes going back a very long time. There was one reference about like when Walter Raleigh first hit the shores, seeing a lot of grapes, but people actually think he was mistaking seaweed for grapes in his first account of seeing all these grapes, because there's seaweed that has these little balls. And there's a funny quote about that. But then later, there is a quote from Sir Walter Raleigh that says, "We have discovered the main to be the goodliest soil under the cope of heaven, so abounding with sweet trees that bring rich and pleasant grapes, such greatness, yet wild as France, Spain, nor Italy hath no greater." So these grapes were all over the place. And in fact, on Roanoke Island, there is a grape known as the mother vine, which is the oldest known grape to man. It's over 400 years old. Some people think it might have been there pre-colonialism, but there is definitely documentation of this particular vine going back to the 1700s.
Wow.
And I've seen pictures of it. I really want to visit it now. It is massive. When the couple who bought the property in the 50s, they said that the tangled branches occupied over 2 acres. And they cut it back and trimmed it, and so now it is only 30 feet by 120 feet.
Wow.
And these giant, they have it in these like giant trellises. And they also gave some of the cuttings of the mother vine to a local vineyard who makes wine from the same, like it's the same plant essentially in a different location. So you can buy that today. You can buy this wine that is from the heritage of a 400-year-old grape, which is pretty cool. Let's get back to that name Scuppernong, which is a very, strange-sounding name. I said Scuppernong is a particular variety of muscadine grape, and they tend to have bigger berries, sweeter fruit. I was trying to figure out what the name Scuppernong came from, and apparently the name Scuppernong comes from an Algonquin word, ascopo, which is the name of the sweet bay laurel tree. So not the grape, but Ascopo means the tree, but then the word Scuppernong apparently means the place of the Ascopo. So a place became known as Scuppernong, and that place also had a lot of these grapes. So they started calling the grape Scuppernong, even though it's a name more associated with a tree. So that's pretty interesting. But it's pretty well known. There's places in the South where the people don't really use the name muscadine grape, or don't even call them grapes. They just call them Scuppernongs. There's a few other, I didn't write them down, but there's a few other like variations on the name Scuppernong, like Sculpin or Sculpin. I don't look them up, but there's a whole bunch of different names for it. But let's now move into the reason why it's meaningful to me is because we have one. I mentioned a little bit before. We are growing. We have a Scuppernong growing in our front yard. It's about 4 years old. We planted it right when we moved in this house, and the first 2 years it was growing a little slowly, but then last year it just exploded, and it grew so fast. It covered this trellis all in 1 year. Just amazing. It's so productive. And like other people, I've heard people trying to grow like European grapes around here, and they have problems because of disease and the heat and everything like this. Not for the Scuppernong. It grows so well, and so much so. Last year was the first year I made 1 bottle of wine with my Scuppernong grapes.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And this year I have, it is now fermenting, which will be my second bottle. Maybe I'll get a little bit more than a bottle this year. I did get more grapes this year, so we'll see. But yeah, it's been really fun to make wine. And if you listen to some other episodes, I'm really into making mead because I'm a beekeeper. But I'm really into these natural, like wild processes for making alcohol, because there's all these things you can read online about being very specific and exact and sterilizing everything and adding yeast and adding all this other stuff. It's very like scientific and chemical, but people have been making alcohol for a long time, and they didn't do any of that stuff. And particularly with grapes have some of the highest sugar content of any fruit in the world, and they'll just ferment. Like, you don't have to do anything, which is fun. Like, you don't have to add yeast. You don't have to do anything. So I basically just take the grapes, the Scuppernongs, and crush them with my hands in a big glass bowl, and then I let them sit on the counter with a cloth over them overnight, and the next morning you can see the bubbling starting to happen.
Wow.
And then I just strain out all the leftovers through a cloth, and it's in a glass jar now, and every day I crack it open and you could tell there's tons of CO2 there, and I shake it up and it bubbles up like crazy. So no, the only ingredient in this is just me squeezing the grape juice, and it's fermenting away very nicely.
So is it going to be a sweet?
The one that I had last year was not. I like to let stuff ferment as long as possible, and I think sometimes wild fermented stuff does stay sweeter because the yeast is not as like strong and can't convert as much of the sugars into alcohol. But mine last year wasn't that sweet. Mine last year, however, was pretty tart, and I think it's because I harvested the grapes a bit too soon. I might have done that again this year, so we'll see. It might be pretty tart and funky. It doesn't. Mine didn't really taste. I mean, it tasted a little winey, but definitely different than like anything you would like buy, and more tart. It is a white wine, so we'll see. I'm curious. It's the fun thing because it is definitely a gamble of like what you're gonna get. But it was drinkable last year. It wasn't very drinkable right away. When I first bottled it, it was really sour, but then I learned this trick that if you put wine like that in the fridge for a while, the more sour components will crash out of solution and sink to the bottom, and then you can pour it off, and it won't be quite as sour.
So is Scuppernong blended with any other type of grapes for the wine market?
Generally, no. I think often the Scuppernong is just made into wine itself, and there is a little bit of like local wine, more in the south actually. Like Virginia, where I live, is a little bit kind of at the northern edge of the Scuppernong because it really is known as like a southern grape. And there are like vineyards around that just make Scuppernong wine, but I don't think anyone's doing any blending of it. I do know there's some the Vitis labrusca, the fox grape, which is the more well-known American grape. People do blend with that around here, and there's some vineyards that make some blends of that grape and European grapes. But I'm not sure if anyone's made blends. That's an interesting question.
I just feel the name Scuppernong is so cool that it's got to be added to everything.
Yeah, we gotta make Scuppernong wine a thing.
Yeah.
The one last little fact is that the variety that I have is called Carlos, which I just think is a fun name for a variety. And it was sometime in the 50s. It was selected, and it was selected because it has these really big fruit, even comparatively to other Scuppernongs. And I don't know why it's called Carlos. I was looking into it and I couldn't figure that out. But the berries, when they're ripe, they look like they're made of bronze. It's really beautiful. Like they start out green, but when they're fully ripe, they have this like shine and bronze color to them that is like something I've never seen in a grape before. So they're really cool.
I assume you picked this variety because of Carla.
I didn't. It was a happy accident. It is the most well-known variety of Scuppernong. There's a few other ones, but it's the one, and it's also very productive and grows. It's one of the more northern ones as well. So as far as like what I could get in this area, it's like when I first heard about muscadines, I was like, I want to grow one of those, and I really wanted to grow grapes in our yard, and I was doing all this research, and everyone was saying, well, if you try to grow grapes, they don't do well, and you got to really baby them because that's hard. But that was talking about the European grape, which aren't suited to this climate, but then I read about the muscadine and I was like, that's so cool. So I had to get one. And yeah, it's growing like crazy. I got to like really trim it down this year because it's kind of growing out of control.
Do you do any pickling?
Not as much as I want to. That's kind of my next road to go into is pickle. I've done a little bit. I've done sauerkraut. I've done some other kinds of lacto-fermented things, but I'm a little bit more into the alcoholic fermentation right now. So I'm making all sorts of different meads. The wine that I can only make once a year because that's when you get the grapes. But then I do like mixing the honey and other things. So I do have one small batch now of grape mead where I took some of the leftover like skins and stuff from my grape my winemaking process and put it in with water and honey as well. So that'll be another drink. But I'm making all sorts of weird meads. If you ever come visit, I'll give you all sorts of strange alcoholic concoctions, which is my hobby that I start. I've been doing for a couple of years now.
Well, that's another reason to come visit.
Indeed.
I was asking if you pickle because I'm just looking at pictures of the Scuppernong on Google, and they have such beautiful leaves. I'm just thinking of making dolmas.
Oh yeah, I really want to do that. The leaf thing has never been in my brain that much, but yeah, I really want to do some stuff with the grape leaves. I've been to Romania a whole bunch, and they have like a dish that's made of like, it's similar, I think, to dolmas that is made with grape leaves. And yeah, I want to try the grape leaf thing because apparently they are just as good as the European grape for doing that kind of like wrapping and steaming thing.
Are the leaves thick, since the grape itself is kind of thick? Or
they're not really thick. They're a little smaller, I think, than you think of normal grape leaves. And I think they're called rotundifolia, which means round-leafed. They're not really round, but maybe they're a little bit less of that grape leaf shape. Maybe they're a little bit more like roundish. I wouldn't have called them rotundifolia if I had the choice. But yeah, they're a bit smaller, so it's going to be a little bit harder to wrap stuff in them. But still possible. I need to explore that because I have a ton of leaves. It's a big plant. So
that's really cool, Steve.
Yeah. Well, that's the Scuppernong, and thanks you for letting me share that with you, and thank you for the really amazing agave facts.
Well, thank you for having me here on today's podcast. I'm really glad I had the opportunity to, share my interest in history through agave with you today.
Riding in a taxi cab, New York City. Driving man saying how he think it's a pity how you southern boys come happen, you leave up time. Don't you worry about me, I'm gonna be alright. Listen, Mr. Taxi Man, come from a long line. Brooms for philosophers and home squeeze Scuppernong wine. Good Georgia wine.
Okay, are you ready? Listen closely. That was the sound of my muscadine wine, or my Scuppernong wine, releasing some of the CO2. I just cracked open the jar for the first time in about a day, and all that CO2 came out. That means that the fermentation is moving along very nicely. I'll post some pictures of this on the social media, but it's looking really good. I'm going to try to shake it up a little bit so we can hear some more of that fizzle of the fermentation. It's one of those swing top jars. All right, I'm going to pick up that whole jar and shake it around a little bit. Oh yeah, there's lots of bubbles now. Yeah, it's looking very foamy. You want to shake this up every now and then in the beginning of the fermentation phase to make sure the yeast stays all alive and bubbly. Okay, I'm going to open it one more time. We should get a nice one last little psh sound from our wine in process. That was pretty cool. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Kristina Markman. Kristina is a travel lover and metalhead who also teaches medieval history at the University of California, San Diego. Rootbound is hosted by the homemade winemaker, Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegescota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, you could track down one of the 3 alcoholic beverages made from agave: tequila, mezcal, or pulque.
Apparently some chimps eat kale. Who knew?